My name is David Daniel Ball. Now, I'm an evangelical Christian, and I've been betrayed by the churches that I have attended. I don't wish to overstate that, and I don't wish to go into unedifying he said, she said type stuff. Well, what I want to do is to highlight what that has meant, and with this unanswered letter, show my progression, my way forward. And it isn't as if I'm alone. It isn't as if I don't have Christian friends. It isn't as if Christians don't love me. It isn't as if I'm cast away. But as Pastor DD said, there's no love in my heart. And that sounds really harsh, but it's a truth, and it's one that can be addressed. It's just that, and I'm not saying it's wrong either, there's considerable anger in my life, and there's considerable bitterness and hatred, and that's not stuff that's of God. But my journey is one of seeking God. And if I do that right, there will be love in my heart. Anyway, this is that unanswered letter. I sent it to a theologian because this is of something that was of interest to me and never got a reply. As I say, I've been betrayed by my churches. I recently heard a very good talk on the issue of the Trinity, and I had some thoughts I wish to share, but I didn't wish to raise at the talk or church Bible study because it might appear argumentative. I want to know if I'm on the right track and to be oriented better if I'm not. So please, I delight in being wrong. It teaches me. My name is David Ball, and I attend the JFC at Cabramatta, and Pastor DD is a friend of mine. My first blush reaction to the academic argument regarding John's Gospel is to throw up my hands and say, it isn't that hard. Putting words into the writer's mouth is not befitting of the learner, but instructor. In many ways, the Gospels are only a reflection of how they are read, and it is dangerous to overstate what is apparent, just as it is a delight to know my Lord by what he shows of himself with his word. I want to know more, but I don't want to try hard to know it. But I know I must persevere. Many things are discovered, and only by discussing them are they remembered. And if we don't, then we risk missing out with faulty tools. My second thought is to do with biblical construction. It was written, but the writers were aware of earlier writings. So in Exodus we see Zipporah and Moses and the importance of circumcision. But the event, although described, is not described perfectly well for those who weren't there. I believe that later Old Testament writers were frustrated by the opaqueness of the text and took steps to be more explicit. So we see Ezekiel disputing with God how he will cook his food. New Testament writers were also aware of the need for transparency and clearly wrote as plainly as they could, not being raised in academic traditions generally, except for Paul and a few others. I get the impression that people like John wrote his gospel as he spoke aloud, probably having discussed the issue many times and sermonized many times before writing it many years later. And so I feel that his words are both deliberate and accidental, related to customary usage mixing with unusual ideas the language had not developed to support. I don't see the testimony as being sufficient to know all of God, but an imperfect reflection allowing us to walk with him and learn from him. But John knew Jesus and faithfully shared what he knew. The distinctions drawn regarding omniscience, omnipotence, etc. seem to me to be imposed constructions related to Greek learning and relevant to things like physics, but not relevant to understanding God. The Bible seems to me to be much easier to read without the imposition of such terms. I have no doubt that Trinity, composed of the 5 points, there is only one God, God the Father, Jesus is God, the Holy Spirit is God, and that other one I forgot to note, is the case. But is it really such a stumbling block to understanding the text? Now, that was the letter that I sent to a friend of a pastor of mine, and I, of course, got no reply to that. I posted a video not long ago on God, and the only reply I got to that was from one person who said that my argument sounded like the God of Islam, Allah, is not the same as the God of Christians. Well, yes, I suppose that's not really anything I've disputed. But that person was trying to say that I hadn't really said anything. But what I'm doing with these videos is putting out an apology, putting out a basis, not one thing to prove God exists, but an argument that demonstrates that the things that people hold to should show them that not only God exists, but that God is worthy.